This is a sermon from St. Paul's Church, Brookfield, Connecticut, transforming lives through Jesus. For more information, go to www.stpaulsbrookfield.com.
So I don't want to make too much of a big deal out of this, but I did realize this past week that today, this Sunday, marks 6 months of my being here at St. Paul's Church. So, how strange, right? Sometimes at moments like this, it's easy to feel, and you hear preachers say this a lot, that it's been both longer and shorter than that, but I confess this morning that I don't feel that way. This morning, I'm only marveling that it's only been that short of a time, that it's only been 6 months. And I don't mean to be too cheesy as I say this, but it feels impossible to think that it's only been 6 months when I think about how much I've come to love you all. And I confess this morning that my heart is full, and I hope you feel the same way too. So I'm grateful to mark this anniversary, or this semi-anniversary, I guess, at the start of this week, Holy Week, as Holy Week is the nerve center of the Christian faith. It's not without reason that nearly 40% of the synoptic Gospels and over half of the Gospel of John are spent recounting the weeks of this final week of Jesus' life. The whole of Jesus' life was important. But this week, what happens this week is the core and the substance of all that Jesus did and said and taught. Holy Week is the entire drama of the Christian faith in Nooch. And the narrative of that drama begins today on Palm Sunday. It begins with a profound irony. Now, I confess I often feel a bit conflicted as a priest when we make you all as a congregation, and every congregation does this, so you're not alone. But I confess I feel conflicted because when we make you all as a congregation wave palm branches around during the procession, we are putting you in the center of that irony. Y'all get what I mean when I say that? So think again about the story we just read as we processed in this morning. As Jesus enters into Jerusalem, he's heralded by the crowds who cry out, "Blessed, the Messiah and the Son of David." And they shout out, "Hosanna," which literally means save now. And yet we know, these enthusiastic people, all of us who stand waving our palm branches, every one of them to the last person will have abandoned Jesus within 5 days' time. So with apologies, that's the role you've been given to play this morning. You've been set up. I'm sorry about that. And this irony is highlighted by what happens directly following our reading from Luke at the Liturgy of the Palms. As soon as Jesus passes by these adoring crowds, he responds to his throngs of admirers by weeping and then declaring judgment over the city. "Peace is hidden from your eyes," he says. "And the days are coming when your enemies will encircle you on every side and dash you to the ground and not leave one stone upon another." And then if that wasn't enough, when Jesus enters into Jerusalem, he walks straight into the temple and drives out all who were buying and selling there, overturning the tables of the money changers. Now, in case you missed it, there's also deep symbolism. There's a deep symbolism in Jesus' actions here. Some of you may remember that on Christmas Day this past year, we talked about how the Shekinah glory of God, the visible, physical manifestation of God's Spirit, actually left the temple during the time of Ezekiel. In case you missed it, in case you skipped church on Christmas Day, right? We walked through a series of passages from the book of Ezekiel in which we watched as the visible, physical manifestation of God's Spirit departed from the temple in stages until it disappeared over the mountains, over the hills to the east of Jerusalem. And that temple, the Shekinah glory of God, that physical, visible manifestation of God's Spirit does not return for 600 years. It didn't return for 600 years until 600 years later, we read these familiar words from earlier in Luke's gospel. They were shepherds keeping watch over the flock by night, and the angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them. On the night that Jesus was born, and really in the person of Jesus, the visible physical manifestation of God's Spirit had returned. The glory of God had come back to its people. So if that's how Luke starts, there's a deep symbolism taking place here in Luke's gospel on Palm Sunday. And you even see that in the connection that the gospel, the liturgy of the Palm, makes to that same chapter in Luke when it says peace in the highest heavens, right? We read that this morning. The way Luke is structured, Jesus never comes to Jerusalem until this moment. Jesus never comes to Jerusalem until the moment of his triumphal entry. And so here on Palm Sunday, as Jesus enters the temple, he is symbolically reenacting the return of God's Spirit to the temple. He's reenacting the final return of God's Spirit after all those years to his temple. And as God's Spirit returns in Jesus, it does so with words of judgment. You've turned my Father's house, it says. You've turned my Father's house into a den of robbers. I confess, I was especially struck this year by those words, you have turned my Father's house into a den of robbers. There's a great story about a very proper Episcopal church where one Sunday a homeless guy came wearing all his street clothes and carrying his bags and admittedly smelling somewhat foul. When he came in, he just walked up to the very front of the church and he just plopped down on the front pew, maybe sitting there next to Linda this morning, right? And so the priest of this very proper Episcopal church comes up to him before the service and says to him, "Son, I don't know what you're thinking." I don't know why he has a southern accent, but let's just go with this for now, right? He says, "Son, I don't know what you're thinking, but this is the house of God. Why don't you go out this week and ask God what you should wear when you come to church?" So a week goes by, and the next Sunday, sure enough, the same homeless guy comes back in, dressed the same way, still carrying his same bags, and plops down again in the first pew next to Linda. Right? So the priest comes up to him again, and before the service says, "Son, did you do what I told you?" And the homeless guy said, "Yeah, I did, Pastor." And God said, "I don't know. I've never been to that church." Now that joke is funny, right? But it also presses a hard question. The same hard question pressed upon us by Palm Sunday. How many of our churches has the Spirit of God left? How many of our churches has God never visited? Here's some honesty for you on Palm Sunday morning. The Episcopal Church is dying. Many churches, of course, are struggling in a post-Christian era, especially having just come through a global pandemic. But we need to be honest. We're dying faster than anyone else. Across the denomination, we've lost 25% of our membership in just the last 10 years, which is a scary stat on its own. Perhaps the scarier stat is that the average Episcopalian is now 69 years old. For some perspective, right? When I became Episcopalian 20 years ago, the average Episcopalian was 53 years old. So we're aging almost a year every year. Now, I hasten to say I rather like 69-year-olds, and I aspire to be one myself one day. And if you are 69 years old or older here in the congregation this morning, just know how loved you are by your priest. That being said, if the average life expectancy in the United States is currently around 77 years, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to agree with the sociologist Ryan Burge that the Episcopal Church is, quote, on the brink of collapse. Now that's the bad news, right? But for my part, bad news is always faced better head on. There's no point in living in denial about it. And that's in part because if we do face it head on, if we face the darkness head on, then we also realize that there is still hope. Now, the full shape of our hope is, of course, the story that we'll tell throughout this coming week, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. You'll have to come back on, Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday if you really want to know how this story ends. But at this point, let me say that in 20 years of ministry, almost 14 years of ordained ministry, having helped churches grow on every level, I've learned two unassailable truths about church vitality. The first is that where the Spirit of God is, where the Spirit of God is, there is life. Where the Spirit of God is, there is life. And the second is that in those places where God has left or never visited, it doesn't matter how good your theology is, or how precise your liturgy is, or how exciting your programming is, or how sound your organizational structure, or your financial health, or your strategic plan, or whatever else is. As important as all those things are, they mean nothing unless the Spirit of God is present. Recall these words Jesus says just before leaving the temple on that first Palm Sunday. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill those who are sent to you. How often I have longed to gather you together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings." God longs for that. And yet Jesus says, "You were not willing. Now see, your house is left to you desolate." So here's the good news, and with it, an invitation. Jerusalem in Jesus' day may not have been willing, but I know that the leadership of this church is. I can't speak for the whole of the Episcopal Church, but I know how deeply and fervently I and Lois and George and the vestry and others on leadership here, I know how deeply they converse with God and pray for all of you who gather here. And I know that out there, many of you sitting in the pews today, or those of you who are joining us from home, I know how many of you long to see the Spirit of God fill the halls of this church too. And so the invitation, as we enter again into the passion of our Lord this week, invite God to dwell richly in your hearts and in this place. Ask God to fill this place again and again with God's Spirit, even if he has to turn over a few tables in order to do it. And let's see that if we seek first the kingdom of God, let's see what God will do.